Greetings, this is Mary Jane Hayden, and today I'm going to tell you about the changes we made to FDM 211, which is the chapter on limited access facilities. The first change I want to tell you about today is found in FDM 211.1.1, Interstate Resurfacing Projects. This language is not new, but the subsection heading is. In the 2018 FDM, the language for interstate resurfacing projects was buried at the tail end of the general section, FDM 211.1. We wanted to simply make this important language a little easier to find, so we created a subsection for it. While we were making that edit, we also wanted to make it easier to read, so we created a bulleted list from what was previously written in the paragraph. As you can see from the language in the red box on the screen here, the 2018 paragraph was clunky and not in an obvious location. The 2019 subsection is much more clear, and you can easily see that for the items listed here, you're allowed to use the AASHTO interstate standards that were in effect at the time of the original construction or inclusion into the interstate system. The next change I want to tell you about is in FDM 211.3.2, which is the section on median crossovers. This past year, we received a recommendation to move the RPM pattern and spacing details for median crossovers into the standard plans, since it's a typical application and does not need to be specifically detailed in the plans. So we thought this was a good suggestion, and we've removed the RPM placement information from the text of this section and added a reference to the standard plans. These updates were also reflected in the associated exhibits. You may also notice that we combined the exhibit for 6 or more lanes and the exhibit for 4 lanes into a single exhibit in the 2019 FDM. Other than removing the RPM details from these drawings, nothing was changed from what has always been in there. In April of 2018, we released Roadway Design Bulletin 1805, which implemented a new policy on emergency shoulder use for limited access facilities and included new language for this section. These ESU routes are specifically identified on the department's emergency management website. Prior to the April bulletin, the requirement was to provide for ESU on the median shoulder on 6-lane limited access evacuation routes, and on the outside shoulder on 4-lane limited access evacuation routes. The bulletin updated this requirement to simply provide ESU on median shoulders when the median paved shoulder width is at least 10 feet, or on the outside shoulder where the median paved shoulder width is less than 10 feet. We realized that the previous language made it somewhat restrictive on where the ESU could be provided, especially when you consider things like barrier walls around bridge piers, guardrail, and exit and entrance ramps. Essentially, this section now says that a minimum 10-foot paved shoulder that is usable for travel is required on all ESU routes in the state. Also, another thing that we added was a figure to illustrate what we mean by usable shoulder. Figure 211.4.5 shows us that if you have shoulder gutter present, you can assume that 2 feet of the shoulder gutter width is included in the usable shoulder width. So if you have an 8-foot paved shoulder with a shoulder gutter with 2 feet of usable width, you will meet the requirements of this section for ESU. We also clarified our guidance for 3R projects. Previously, the FDM language said that shoulder widths for ESU that are less than the 10-foot minimum should be addressed by 3R projects. We've replaced this vague language with something more direct, which is shown here. So for resurfacing projects where you have less than 10 feet of usable width for ESU, you need to either provide shoulder modifications to allow for acceptable ESU usage, or you need to identify a future project that can provide the required shoulder modifications. Finally, we also added in a couple of statements about not locating median barrier adjacent to the shoulder identified for ESU whenever possible, and also added a reference to FDM 240.1.1 for temporary traffic control requirements for ESU. Those requirements are discussed in the webinar for FDM 240, so please be sure to watch it. We realized that some important language from the PPM was inadvertently omitted in FDM 211.9. PPM Volume 1, Section 2.6 stated that the base clearance water elevation for turnpike facilities is to be designed above the 100-year floodplain elevation. The reason for having this language is to do our best to design our hurricane evacuation routes to an elevation where flooding will be unlikely to occur. So we've brought this language into the FDM in the 2019 manual, here in Section 211.9, Vertical Alignment. We didn't change the requirements of this language. However, we did add to it by saying that designing mainline travel lanes to be above the 100-year floodplain elevation should be considered for all limited access facilities. So it's still a requirement for Florida's turnpike facilities and a consideration for all other limited access facilities. Also, another change that we made to the vertical alignment section was in the subsection on grades. Table 211.9.1, which is our maximum grades table, previously listed NA for maximum grades. However, we realized that we do have ramps that may have design speeds of 55 miles per hour and higher, so we needed to add this information. So we now have criteria for maximum grades on ramps with design speeds of 55 miles per hour and greater. FDM 211.12.1, weaving sections, was new language in the 2018 FDM. We wanted to build on what we started with last year and make some clarifications this year. So we created a new subsection specifically for braided ramps and added a couple of figures to help illustrate what we were trying to describe in the text. As you can see here, we describe what a braided ramp is and what they are typically used for. We've also added two figures to further illustrate braided ramp configurations. Figure 211.12.2 shows an example of a braided ramp that may be used for entrance and exit ramps at interchanges. Figure 211.12.3 shows an illustration of combining general use or general toll lane exits with express lane exits. As you can see in this figure, the express lane's exit ramp crosses over the general use or general toll lanes and their exit ramp, and then merges together. Some things are just easier to describe if there's an accompanying figure, and that's why we added these two figures here. The final change that we'll go over today is the addition of two new exhibits in the express lane's access point and access type section, FDM 211.14. We realized that the 2018 FDM included several helpful exhibits that show us how to get in and out of express lanes at intermediate locations through the use of slip ramps and weave sections. However, we never actually show you how to begin or end those express lanes. So in the 2019 FDM, we added those details to this section, and they're included as exhibits 211-3 and 211-4. All of the other exhibits remain the same with the exception of updating the cross-references within those sheets. This concludes the webinar on the 2019 updates to FDM 211. Thank you for listening.